simulated gavel. The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statement, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. I want to say on behalf of all of us, thank you to our witnesses for being here to talk about what I think is an extremely important issue, the issue of the future of what we're seeing with regards to Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan. As we actually look forward right now at a post-2014 plan in Afghanistan, we see that the threat of Al-Qaeda, in my mind, has not diminished really at all from what we saw pre-9/11. We continue to see a country that's overridden by Al-Qaeda. It's no secret that I support a strong, robust residual force to protect the significant strides that we've made in Afghanistan. I recently had the privilege of leading a CODEL to Pakistan and Afghanistan this past November with the hope of getting an objective view of what is needed on the ground by our troops, our commanders, and our State Department personnel serving in the region. I came away with a renewed sense of optimism on happenings on the ground. The Afghan forces have been improving. The green on blue killings that was strategized by our enemy to try to undermine the sense of trust that exists have been on the decline. Infiltrators have been sharply cut down, and we're no longer conducting unilateral missions except for counterterrorism operations. With that said, Al-Qaeda remains very strong. Reducing our footprint in Afghanistan will inevitably curtail our ability to directly confront Al-Qaeda in the region. Making post-2014 troop-level determinations, we must fully evaluate the risk that come with a too aggressive drawdown. To arbitrarily pick a number based on political expediency diminishes the sacrifice that our brave men and women continue to make in Afghanistan. You know, I remember in 2001, I was actually driving to work, and I had just graduated from Illinois State University, and I remember hearing that a plane hit the World Trade Center, and it went through my mind as a newly minted private pilot. I said, well, how in the world can a plane hit a building on a beautiful morning? And then I heard a second plane hit the World Trade Center, and then the field in Pennsylvania, and the Pentagon not far from here. And at that point, I think American life changed completely. Up through the 90s, we were under this impression that America was a country that was protected by two oceans. The idea of any kind of a terrorist attack was always for over there and not necessarily for here, with the exception of the occasional domestic terrorist. And that whole reality was changed. And as a country, we mobilized to this idea of defeating Al-Qaeda where they exist. This idea of finding America's enemies that would seek to destroy us and, in essence, destroying them first and depriving them of their ability to recruit more people and more fighters. You know, I think when you look at history of both Iraq and Afghanistan, we can judge the last 10 to 13 years and say there were things we could have done better. I think there are things we could have done worse. But when I look into Afghanistan today and I see girls going to school, I see women with rights that they didn't have prior to 9/11. I see Al-Qaeda with the fear that there's going to be a missile that strikes them at any moment. I think we've made a lot of gains. And my big concern, and one of the things I look forward to hearing from the witnesses about, my big concern is that for the hope of political expediency, as I briefly touched on, we are going to end what President Obama called the good war, the war in Afghanistan, that we're going to end this prematurely simply to follow a campaign promise. So I do look forward to hearing from the witnesses. And at this point, I'll turn over to the ranking member, Mr. Sherman from California, for 5 minutes for his opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will be in and out of this room because for me, today is a festival of subcommittees. We have not only this, but the Asia Subcommittee and the Insurance Subcommittee all meeting simultaneously. I thank the witnesses for being here. I was hoping to see my old friend Hussein Haqqani, who I know cannot be here for medical reasons. This hearing will help us understand Al-Qaeda's evolving structure and hopefully help us craft a more effective counterterrorism policy. Al-Qaeda has failed to carry out a major attack on the United States homeland. However, the danger still remains. Al-Qaeda's structure, of course, has become more decentralized, with most terrorist activity now conducted by its regional and local affiliates. Over the past few years, Al-Qaeda's core in Pakistan has been weakened by the loss of key leaders, most notably a a truly heroic attack that netted bin Laden, one that took incredible courage from our special forces to carry out, and also took very substantial political courage to order. I am sure that the efforts by President Carter to rescue our hostages came to mind when political leaders had to make the decision as to whether to go forward with that mission, and of course that decision was correct. Congress should work with the administration to reform the authorization for the use of military force. I was here when that was passed. It was passed in haste, as it should have been, with great emotion, which was natural. But it now needs substantial revision to balance our desire to deal with terrorism on the one hand and defend our privacy and liberties on the other. And now, as we see Boko Haram and other terrorist organizations that may not fall under the ambit of the authorization to use military force because they may not exactly be linked, maybe ideologically linked, to Al-Qaeda, but such terrorist organizations pose just as great a threat to us as the Al-Qaeda franchises. So whether you have the Al-Qaeda franchise in North Africa or Yemen or wherever, or you don't, Islamic extremism poses a threat to the United States. Our systematic effort to dismantle terrorist organizations must continue, as the President himself said. We'd like to end this war. It is the longest in our history, but we can't end it until the enemy is vanquished. As to whether we are leaving Afghanistan too quickly and for political reasons, I would have to disagree with our acting chairman. First of all, remember it was not this administration who picked Karzai and installed him. And it is Karzai who, to this moment, is prohibiting any troops from remaining in Afghanistan through past the end of this year. The generals, our chief of our military staff, has determined what is an appropriate number of forces to leave there with the goal of combating terrorism and training the Afghan army. This is not a political decision. This is an appropriate military decision, and I think that we ought to unify behind it. The United States, hopefully with a new president of Afghanistan, will remain active in that country. We continue to offer a $25 million reward for Zawahiri. We continue to seek out the other key Al-Qaeda leadership. I'd like our witnesses to focus on a number of issues. One of those is the current strength and capacities of Afghan security forces and their adversaries, the Taliban, the Haqqani network, Al-Qaeda itself. The second is the nature of the ISI's relationship with the Afghan Taliban, the Pakistani Taliban, the Haqqani network, and Al-Qaeda. And Islamabad's cooperation with the United States. And this is a truly difficult to understand situation. It is clear that there are elements of the Pakistani government that are cooperating with terrorists, and it is clear that there are terrorists who, given the chance, would murder the entire family of many of the leaders in the Pakistani government. It's a politics I don't completely understand. Perhaps the witnesses will shed some light on it. I hope they also focus on how well the Gulf states are in stopping terrorist financing, and whether there are any elements of the terrorist organizations that we're talking about here that some of those countries find acceptable as a recipient of charitable dollars. So we have a lot to hear, and I'll yield back.
Well, thank you, Mr. Sherman. Without objection, all of the witnesses' prepared statements will be made part of the record. I ask that each witness please keep your presentation to no more than 5 minutes, and we'll begin with our first panel of witnesses. Mr. David Sedney is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asia in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs. Mr. Sedney has received the Secretary of Defense Medal for Meritorious Civilian Service, the Department of State's Superior Honor Award 6 times, and the Department of State's Meritorious Honor Award twice. It's nice to have you here, sir. Mr. Sedney, we'll start with you. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, Representatives. Thank you for holding this hearing, the subject of which I think is vital to national security. As both of you have pointed out in your statements, Al-Qaeda remains a threat to the United States. There is a narrative about Al-Qaeda that I think is proving to be increasingly wrong. And that narrative is that Al-Qaeda is much less of a threat today and is on the way to extinction or to strategic defeat. That narrative I find is belied by the facts. And I think it's very important for us to look at this, and my co-panelists are more experienced in some of the ramifications, but I'll look at it very much from the perspective of Afghanistan and Pakistan. We went into Afghanistan after 9/11, as you described, Mr. Chairman, with the explicit intention of defeating Al-Qaeda and making sure that the Taliban couldn't come back to Afghanistan and make a safe haven for Afghanistan again for themselves and for Al-Qaeda or similar terrorist organizations. We have succeeded for the time being in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda is virtually not present in Afghanistan except for a small group in Nuristan, which is primarily right now focused on events inside Afghanistan, is not at least in my judgment, is not a direct threat to the United States now, but could be in the future if pressure was not continued to be placed on them. However, where did Al-Qaeda go? It went to Pakistan. And as the ranking member described, we have kept, and you, Mr. Chairman, have described, we have kept strong pressure on Al-Qaeda, but we've not managed to defeat Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda still has a number of leaders there. There are still numbers of adherents for Al-Qaeda that go to Pakistan seeking training, seeking entry. Al-Qaeda is very choosy about who they let in into their ranks, but they continue to have people who want to join. The reason for that is what is important about Al-Qaeda is not so much any individual leader, it's the organization, and what's important about the organization is the ideology behind it. And that ideology is based on a belief that it is the destiny of humanity to live under a caliphate similar to that which ruled in what is now Saudi Arabia almost 1,500 years ago. The Al-Qaeda have been very explicit in that is their goal, the recreation of a caliphate, and to have it first in the areas where their religion began, but then to have it spread throughout the entire world. So this is really an ideological study, ideological conflict, and the attraction of people who come to join Al-Qaeda is an attraction of ideology. They believe in that vision as well. They see the United States and our Western allies as an obstacle to achieving that vision, and they see the country of Afghanistan as a place where they played a major role. This is their narrative, in defeating one of the two superpowers of the 20th century, the Soviet Union, and that they are now in the process of defeating the second superpower, now the world's only superpower, the United States in Afghanistan. And they do so because they have this narrative because they are less worried about what happened yesterday or what's happening today, or what's happening tomorrow, than what their destiny is, which is to take over first Afghanistan and then other areas that they want to have the caliphate in. The effort in Afghanistan after the United States pushed the Taliban out and pushed the Al-Qaeda out in 2001 has been a extremely strong and resilient effort on the part of the Taliban with the support of Al-Qaeda. When I was in Afghanistan from 2002, 3, and 4, we clearly had some initial successes, but we saw the buildup of opposition to the government there, and it was very effective. By 2008, Afghanistan was close to falling to the Taliban, and if they had, they would have brought Al-Qaeda back with them. President Obama announced a surge and put in place a surge that pushed the Taliban back, but it has far from negated the Taliban's ability to threaten the state of Afghanistan. One of the most important successes in response to the ranking member's question about the capability of the Afghan security forces is one of the most important success stories for Afghanistan is the success of the Afghan security forces, particularly the Afghan army, which in the recent elections had not just a lead role, but almost completely exclusive responsibility for protecting those elections against the Taliban's declared intention to prevent those elections from happening. Not only did they not prevent them from happening, but the elections succeeded beyond anyone's expectation, with almost twice as many people voting this year's election as did 5 years ago. That's a strategic defeat for the Taliban and a strategic defeat for Al-Qaeda. That's the kind of strategic defeat that we need to continue to inflict by having the kind of strong military and civilian and assistance presence in Afghanistan that you described, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Sedney. The Honorable Michael Sheehan is the distinguished chair of the Combating Terrorism Center at the West Point Military Academy. Ambassador Sheehan has held positions at the New York Police Department, United Nations, U.S. Department of State, and was appointed by President Clinton as Ambassador at Large for Counterterrorism. Honored to have you here, sir. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. I'll keep my remarks short. My general theme is that we need to be a little bit more optimistic in what we're going to be able to achieve in Afghanistan and in fighting Al-Qaeda and affiliates around the world, because sometimes our pessimism undermines our will to persevere in a war that I think is very winnable if we maintain certain tracks of action. Let me highlight 5 key points from my written testimony, if I could, Mr. Chairman. First, that our CT policy in the AFPAC region for the last 13 years actually has been an enormous success by the most important metric, and that's to prevent Al-Qaeda from coming to our homeland and attacking again. It's very important to recognize this. We can push these guys back when we're determined. Number 2, the AFPAC area, both sides of the border, is a unique place on the planet that breeds international terrorism and a brand of international terrorism with a history of targeting United States homeland. Number 3, Afghanistan is a winnable war, but we must narrow our objectives, be a little bit more optimistic, and we're going to need to stay the course a little bit longer. But it is winnable. We should not despair. There's too much pessimism coming out of the news every day that the Pakistani government is hopelessly corrupt, that the Afghan government is corrupt, the Pakistani government is helping the Taliban, that things are horrible. We need to remain a little bit optimistic in order to persevere. 4th, a U.S. military and intelligence presence is absolutely essential to be in Afghanistan in order for us to continue our war against Al-Qaeda Central, which currently resides in western Pakistan, primarily in the Fatah, as you know, the federal administered tribal areas. 5th, we need to guarantee our mission in Afghanistan, if required, in my view, with U.S. air power, directed by our soft elements that are on the ground there, if the Kabul government is threatened to be toppled by the Taliban. And if we recall that combination of U.S. air power and U.S. Special Forces after 9/11, they routed the Taliban within a few months. That's a very lethal combination. Of course, that type of authorization will only be provided by the President of the United States and the highest levels in Afghan. Let me quickly elaborate on these 5 points. First, about our counterterrorism policy is enormous success. We have to remember that prior to 9/11, when Al-Qaeda was not under pressure, they attacked us 3 times strategically in 37 months. That's a strategic attack every year. They attacked our embassies in East Africa, the USS Cole, and 9/11 attacks from 1998 to 2001. If you leave Al-Qaeda alone, they will have the capability to attack us strategically, either at home or on core assets that are abroad. That is a clear lesson of that time. But when we're able to put pressure on them, as we have in the Fatah primarily over the last 3 years, we've prevented them from being able to organize those types of strategic attacks, and they have tried to do so. I'll go into some of those examples if I have time later. Secondly, the AFPAC area is unique. It is the heart of Al-Qaeda that has attacked the U.S. historically. It's a unique place, a stew of foreign fighters, wannabe terrorists, and numerous violent jihadi groups with agendas against Afghanistan, the United States, India, Pakistan. Many of them are supported by the Pakistani government for different agendas. They mix together in a very lethal combination of organizations that sometimes work together, sometimes independently, but they're very problematic. We should recall my nightmare from when I was at NYPD, someone like Faisal Shahzad, the Times Square bomber. Lived in Connecticut, smart guy, married, Wall Street guy, traveled to Pakistan 4 times, wanted to get to Al-Qaeda but couldn't, and was trained by the TTP. Fortunately, his training was bad, and the bomb in Times Square fizzled out. In my view, that was not an accident. His failure was a direct result of the pressure we put on those groups in the Fatah. If we remove the pressure, they will reconstitute the safe houses, training areas, lines of communication, indoctrination places that existed prior to 9/11, when I was ambassador at large for counterterrorism, and I was looking through different aerial images of bin Laden in his camps, and we weren't able to get to him. They were not under pressure, and they were able to attack us. We can never allow that to happen again. Third point, the U.S. presence in Afghanistan is essential to continue continue pounding Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan. There is simply no other viable alternative than Afghanistan. Especially now after Ukraine, the countries up in the north, it's very unlikely we're going to be able to do anything there, and it's too far away. The seaborne area where we conducted operations, I launched missiles from the Indian Ocean 98, 99, that doesn't work very well either. We need to be in Afghanistan, not only because it's close, but to continue our human intelligence, our other intelligence operations that enable us to pound Al-Qaeda in the Fatah or in Afghanistan if they try to get back in there. Number 4, this is a winnable war. Too often we despair. The Taliban are not 10 feet tall. They do have sanctuary in Pakistan, however, which is extremely problematic. An insurgency always needs sanctuary, either ideally across a border, which gives them some protection, or in some remote area within the country. The Taliban use both, but that border area of Pakistan, the support they get from them, is extremely problematic. And we should understand, while that happens, and I don't see it stopping anytime soon, the Taliban is going to be around for a long time. They will likely control areas in Afghanistan for a long time, and they will be able to conduct the periodic terrorist attacks in Kabul that we see. But I hope that the Afghan government can persevere through that. The conditions of the 1990s when the Taliban took over Afghanistan do not exist now, and their prospects are dim for repeating that. And one of it has to do with the security forces that are in Afghanistan that David Sedney talked to. This is a serious army. I've been out many times with their special forces units that were trained by our special forces units, about 14 or 15,000 of them. These are tough fighters, committed to action, multi-ethnic, and a serious fighting force. So it's a very different situation than the 90s. Fifth and finally, I believe we must guarantee our commitment to Afghanistan with the U.S. Air Force there, supported by SOF on the ground, just in case the Taliban try to run up the Ring Highway like they did in 95 and 96. If they were to do that with a major offensive, we can pound them, rout them into submission, and keep the government secure. So in sum, the area of Afghanistan and Pakistan is of vital interest to U.S. security. It is uniquely a terrorist threat to our homeland. We must remain in Afghanistan in order to deal with the threat in Pakistan. Perhaps 10,000 or some other number that's kicked around may be enough, but we need to have the right forces there in order to sustain that operation. And we should be optimistic that we can do that. And my final point,
I'll have to ask you to wrap it up very briefly, sir.
my final point, Mr. Chairman, is that Al-Qaeda, unique among other organizations, seeks WMD and would use it tomorrow to kill us in mass numbers. Thank you.
Well said. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Mr. Tom Jocelyn, is that correct? All right. He's a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and senior editor of the Long War Journal, a publication dealing with counterterrorism and related issues. Much of his research focuses on how Al-Qaeda and its affiliates operate around the globe. Sir, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you to this committee for inviting me here to testify again before you. It's a great honor. I'm just going to make 5 quick points. I'm the counterterrorism nerd, and I tend to delve in the weeds, and I promise not to do that here very quickly. My 5 quick points are, one of the big things that I really sort of was eye-opening for me, and I think for the Long War Journal, was that most of Al-Qaeda's assets since its existence, since its founding in 1988, have actually not been focused on attacking us. That's somewhat of a stark revelation. Actually, most of their assets have been focused on other things, mainly waging insurgencies against quote-unquote local governments, trying to seize power for themselves throughout the Muslim world and throughout South Asia, all the way through the Middle East into North Africa. That's important because I think that it's not by any accident that what's going on around the world. We see these Al-Qaeda groups, Al-Qaeda-style groups, sort of popping up throughout this whole wide area. The second point I'd like to make is that there's still a lot of confusion about how to define Al-Qaeda. You hear a lot of talk about Al-Qaeda Corps and everything else as affiliates. I think what's really meant by Al-Qaeda Corps is actually what's known as the General Command of Al-Qaeda. And this is actually an organization, to Mr. Sedney's point, that still exists. If you go back to the 9/11 Commission report, there were several committees in the Al-Qaeda prior to 9/11. These committees still exist. They've been reorganized. They've been restaffed. But there's still an infrastructure of bureaucracy that Al-Qaeda exists. So despite all of the successes we've had in killing and capturing top Al-Qaeda leaders, they still have this organization. And if you go back to my testimony before this committee last July, I pointed out that this organization is not confined to South Asia, that some of this leadership in the General Command is actually elsewhere. And my big point was that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is headed by the protege and former aide-de-camp to Osama bin Laden. And in fact, a couple weeks after my testimony, that same guy, Nasser al-Wahishi, was actually appointed to be the general manager of Al-Qaeda globally. Okay? Now, this is a core function. So we talk about core, you hear core Al-Qaeda in these types of terms, they're very loosely defined. They don't really make a lot of sense to me. I think what you really have is an international networked organization that has what they call their general command, which makes decisions for the organization. The third point is, what is this organization actually doing in the Afghanistan and Pakistan region? Well, one of the main things it's been doing, yes, they've been plotting attacks against us unsuccessfully and trying to have mass casualty attacks in the West. They've absolutely been trying to do that. But one of the other things they've been doing, and primarily where their focus has been, is what they call their shadow army, which sounds kind of spooky and conspiratorial, and it kind of is. But what they've done is they've built this basically a force multiplier for the insurgents in the region to try and make their attacks more efficient and effective against Afghan forces, coalition forces, and those types of things. Now, why is this important? Well, a lot of times we can't actually detect Al-Qaeda's hand. They don't announce exactly what they're doing a lot of times, but we can see it if you do very careful analysis. And so Al-Qaeda is still very much in the region, still very much in the fight in Afghanistan. Everybody knows about their hub in Kunar, Nuristan, where they have a very prominent Al-Qaeda leader leading the charge. But we detect them elsewhere in other provinces. And in fact, one of the few documents released from bin Laden's compound reveals that Osama bin Laden told his minions basically to disperse out of northern Pakistan to several provinces in Afghanistan, and we've been able to track operatives who took him up on that. The fourth point is that one of the reasons why Al-Qaeda is still alive or still in the game is they've developed what we call strategic depth in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and it's what former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates called the syndicate model. Now, I wish I had come up with this phrase, syndicate, to describe it, because it's actually better than anything I've got. But Gates was right, and what it is they have these close relationships with all these other groups in the area. And a lot of these other groups, to Ranking Member Sherman's point, actually are sponsored by the ISI. And so what Al-Qaeda has been able to do is, as we kill or capture senior Al-Qaeda leaders, a lot of times they've been able to replace those leaders with guys from other groups in the syndicate. And that's what makes them so effective and sort of keeps them going. And finally, when we talk about, just a final point about the international network of Al-Qaeda and what it really is, This general command, as I said, it doesn't just exist in South Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan. It actually stretches across several countries. And some of these groups in these countries, these what we call affiliates or something along those lines, I don't actually like the word affiliates. Some of these are actually regional branches of Al-Qaeda that have sworn allegiance or bayat to Ayman al-Zawahiri, the head of Al-Qaeda. They answer up the command in the chain to senior leadership in Pakistan and elsewhere. And the best example of that today is Syria, where we see this traffic going back and forth between Pakistan and Afghanistan and Syria. And this shows, to my mind, that we're not dealing with this sort of discrete core entity in Pakistan and Afghanistan that can be droned to death, but in fact an international network that poses a lot graver challenges. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and again, thank you to the witnesses for being here and providing us with your fantastic insight. I'll go ahead and start with my questions. I've always been amazed America's had this, and I guess it's a testimony to how, in essence, opposed to war we are at our base, at the heart. But anytime we get engaged in somewhere, we immediately start talking about the withdrawal strategy and how to leave and how to get out. And I will say that Afghanistan has been a very long war. We understand that. But I will remind people that America has not yet been defeated on the battlefield. When we engage with Taliban or Al-Qaeda, we win. So the only way we will ever be defeated in Afghanistan is if our willpower is defeated, not necessarily our military might. And so my concern and my questions will somewhat center around the fact of, in 10 or 20 years, history is going to write the decisions that we made today. And we have two options. We can either have the history books read that, the Afghan people had victory, and the Afghan people were able to secure their own country, and women still have freedom, and they can go to school, and they can be successful. Or we can read the thing that said America, at a time when we were pressing the fight against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, decided that we had had enough. I guess 1% of America actually serves in the military. I served and still continue to serve in the military, but yet somehow we have a war fatigue despite 99% of Americans having never served. I also would like to remind Mr. Sherman, he's not here, I'm not talking bad about him, but Mr. Karzai will be gone shortly, and we will have a new president of Afghanistan, I think, which will be a positive development. Let me ask the entire panel, and try to keep it as brief as you can. How many U.S. troops do you believe are required to remain in Afghanistan post-2014 to combat Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda's allies? And let's keep it as short as you can. We'll just start this way.
I believe a total force of around 16,000, that would be about 10,000 U.S. and about 6,000 NATO's is the minimum that's necessary to carry out those dual goals of having capability to carry out counterterrorism operations and train, advise, and assist and equip the Afghan army. A smaller number than that becomes purely a self-defense force. They're only there defending themselves and don't accomplish anything.
It's just cooking food and protecting the fences, basically. Mr. Ambassador?
I would agree with that number, sir. That's the number that's kind of been kicked around, the interagency, the Department of Defense and CIA primarily. My concern is if we go below that the CIA will have to withdraw even further back and that we're going to lose our insight into the Fatah. Also, the military needs to be able to protect the counterterrorism assets that conduct the attacks against Al-Qaeda. So I agree that number is a minimum.
I just remind everybody what we see in Iraq today, right? The place where the Marines fought the hardest they've fought since Kaysan is now controlled by ISIS, because the administration, I believe, for a political reason, so they could follow through on a political promise, pulled all the troops out of Iraq, and we find ourselves today with a lawless Western Iraq, also based out of Syria. Mr. Jocelyn, in terms of the number of troops.
Well, I'm actually not a military expert, so I'll defer to these gentlemen, but I think 10 to 20,000 sounds about right in terms of the numbers to protect our forces and to actually keep in the fight there in the region. One of the big things you have to keep your eye on is the ability for the drone and airstrike campaign to keep going, and the bottom line is unless we have the proper forces in place to protect those assets and protect those bases, in addition to taking the fight to the enemies in Afghanistan, then that's going to necessarily impact our ability to strike in Pakistan and elsewhere.
How would you all rate the administration's current counterterrorism strategy? Does it have one? And if so, is it successful? I guess we can start with you, sir, again, and then go right to left. My right to left.
Well, I think the administration has had success in taking out certain key senior Al-Qaeda leaders, obviously, including Osama bin Laden. I think the Bush administration had success in that regard before them. I think the problem, again, is I think both administrations early on have made the same mistake, which is they define Al-Qaeda as sort of this top-down pyramid with a hierarchical structure. If you sort of lop off the top of the pyramid, the whole thing crumbles. They had that debate, that discussion about how to organize themselves about 20 years ago, and they decided against that organizational structure. And yet we still fight them a lot of times like they're structured that way. And so they're growing in other ways.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. How would you rate the current
You
CT
did mention,
strategy?
Mr. Chairman, I was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations, Low Intensity Conflict. I just left that job last year, so I was part of the administration. So do I think they have good strategy? I do. Their strategy is to conduct kinetic and direct action strikes against those organizations that directly threaten the United States or U.S. personnel. For other groups that have not yet directly threatened the U.S., the strategy is more to assist the host country for them defeating them. So far, they've been successful. I think they need to stay the course. The bottom line metric is protecting the homeland. That has been done, but there are a lot of problems out there. I think they need to stay the course that they've done the last few years, and I hope they will.
Mr. Chadney?
I agree with my former colleague. We served together at the Pentagon, Ambassador Sheehan, that the administration has had a lot of successes on the counterterrorism field. However, it's not just, you can't distinguish counterterrorism from all the other aspects of our state and governmental policy. And I think, for example, the long debate over the last 2 years about whether there should be a zero option in Afghanistan has led to improved morale for Al-Qaeda and others, has led other states such as Pakistan to hedge their policies against the possibility of a zero option in the United States. So while the counterterrorism policy, which I would say is sort of a subset of the overall policy, I think has a lot of successes, I think the overall ability to counter that has been undercut by the fact we've not made that definitive commitment to Afghanistan that you mentioned before.
And I think if we exercise the zero option, I think we'll double or triple the size of Al-Qaeda overnight, because we'll hand them the strongest moral victory that they've had in decades. And let me just finally say, because I want to live by example since I'm going to have to bring the gavel down on people, 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 troops are kind of a high-risk option, medium-risk, and low-risk option. In my mind, I think we need to put the number of troops in theater to provide the low-risk option, both to protect our men and women in the field and also to protect the victory for the Afghan people. So I appreciate all you all answering my questions. At this point, I'd like to recognize Mr. Schneider of Illinois, the same great state, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the witnesses for your testimony and insight, but also for your service long before this. Ambassador, I'd like to touch on something you said. You talked about Afghanistan or AFPAC being unique and distinctive. As you were saying that, I was thinking about what's taking place in Syria, in Yemen, in Sinai, and thinking that while each of these are unique, there seems to be a lot of commonality. And so I guess I'll start with a series of questions. Is what makes Afghanistan, Pakistan so unique from the others? What lessons apply across the others? What coordination do we see with the affiliates of Al-Qaeda in these other regions? And what happens, A, if we win, and this I'll throw out to the whole group, if we are able to win, as you say, in Afghanistan, does that just push the balloon out to bulging in these other areas?
Thank you, sir. Let me try to answer a few of those questions. First of all, why is it unique? Because of their track record. They actually have killed people and blown things up in the U.S. and against our other targets, them and AQAP. So it's the Al-Qaeda Central and AFPAC that is my number one concern for attacking the homeland. Secondly, the AQAP, which also has a track record. The other organizations right now, although potentially very, very problematic, are currently focused on the local fight. Whether eventually they shift to Europe first, then the U.S., we'll see. Certainly the potential is there. They're the same type of folks that were committed to attack us, so we have to be prepared for them to be able to shift their focus now, which is local, to the local enemy, as they call it, the near enemy, to the far enemy, which is the United States and Europe. Remains to be seen when or if they will do that. But that's why they're unique. Pakistan also is unique because of the various groups that are there that have been supported by the Pakistani state. Groups like the Lashkar-e-Taiba that have attacked in India, directed by Pakistani intelligence, murdering people in a hotel in Mumbai. This is a unique situation where a state is actually involved in these organizations that are part of the stew I talked about earlier that directly threaten us. And so these are very serious organizations like the Haqqani Network, the Pakistani Taliban. They're very well funded. They're ideologically determined, and they have capability, and they have a track record. That's why I worry about that area. That's why I believe we have to stay there and continue pounding these people relentlessly for quite a while.
I agree entirely with the Ambassador's analysis and leave that to others.
Mr. Jocelyn, thoughts?
My caveat there is that while other parts of the Al-Qaeda network have not yet been successful or attempted a mass casualty attack on the U.S., there's always a potential there for that. The problem is that many of the senior Al-Qaeda leaders, or some of the senior Al-Qaeda leaders who were part of that general command in Afghanistan or Pakistan, have relocated elsewhere. For example, in Syria, just last week, the Treasury Department highlighted a very senior Al-Qaeda operative. He's a guy who was on the military committee for Al-Qaeda. He's involved, according to the Treasury Department, with a group in Syria that's plotting attacks against Western targets. So their leadership is sprinkled amongst several different countries, not just in Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Maybe the question, coming back to Ambassador Sheehan, you talk about victory or winning in Afghanistan. Does, however you define it, a victory in Afghanistan just shift the battlefield, shift the front to one of these other areas?
It will to a certain extent, sir. They will move, I think. But by the way, I don't think there will ever be a definitive victory in Western Pakistan for decades. These people this is at least a multi-generational fight. They are not going away. They are burrowed into the mountains up there. They are committed. We're going to be there a long, long time. But as Tom said earlier, they are already dispersing. They're already starting to direct these, taking advantages of countries that have lost their rule of law or have ungovernable places, like now we're seeing in northern Nigeria. They take advantage of those places, Mali, Libya, et cetera, and are stirring up a very fertile ground to recruit radical jihadis of the same ideology. So they're already doing that, but having said that, I still don't think they're going away in Pakistan.
And I know we're tight on time. Let me turn to Mr. Sedney, because as you talk, where you're going to see these lines, I think, is where there are seams, whether it's in Nigeria or in Syria, where you have failed states and there's gaps and seams that these groups can operate within. The challenge ultimately becomes, as you talked about it, Mr. Sedney, a sense of ideology or destiny. Is there any path, any strategy we can put together that will address the ideology as opposed to just the tactics of terrorism?
Yes, there is, and I think it's emerging sometimes despite our lack of a coordinated effort on that. And that's what's happening in Afghanistan right now, because yes, Al-Qaeda has been trying to support the Taliban. The Taliban have been trying very actively, but in the elections that took place last month in Afghanistan, young people turned out. And the message from these young people across ethnic lines, the message from women was that the vision of the future that the Al-Qaeda and Taliban put out of a return to the caliphate, of a inward-looking, backward-looking, oppressive regime, they rejected that. In the Afghan media, the number one headline after the elections was, we said no to the Taliban. By saying no to the Taliban, they said no to Al-Qaeda. That is a competing vision for the future that can be applicable in other societies as well. Every one of the other societies you mentioned, every other place that Al-Qaeda can go also has young people. That's the battleground. And if Afghanistan, despite all the problems it's had, can be a success, then those other states can be a success too. But I agree entirely with Ambassador Sheehan. This is not something that's going to happen by a certain date or time. It's a multi-generational struggle, and it's one that it's going to be very hard for us to have the commitment that's needed.
Well, thank you. I wish we could spend more time. I'm out of time, but again, thank you for your time and service.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. Now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Joycelyn, now let me direct it, I'm sorry, to Mr. Sedney. Do the Afghan National Security Forces currently have the capabilities and equipment to combat, they have the skills to combat Al-Qaeda?
They have some of them. They have the basic fighting ability. They have the fighting spirit. They have the on-the-ground organization tactically. What they lack are key enablers. The most important one is the one that Mr. Sheehan already highlighted, is air air power, both transport and attack aircraft, as well as helicopters. They lack advanced capabilities in intelligence, which is really key to the kind of struggle they're fighting. And in areas of logistics and organization, they still need to make a great deal of progress. And those are the kind of capabilities that require years more to for them to be successfully acquired. And without that, they risk degrading in the future. So they have a good start, but we need to stay the course.
I would concur with that. I just wanted to hear your assessment. I would turn to the good ambassador here. Regarding a report that we have in our reading here that in October of 2013, there was a police raid in Islamabad regarding a house that was purpose-built, as it's described, with a lab in the basement dedicated to the research and development of explosives-laden drone aircraft. If I couple that with your comment regarding Al-Qaeda's specific and very particular interest in WMD, can you put those two together for me and describe the threat as you see it, if there is a nexus between the two? And then who are the enablers to that threat?
Yes, sir. Everybody wants drones now, and actually you can buy a drone at in a store here in the United States. You can buy a helicopter with a camera on it. Putting a weapon on it is very much more difficult. So I don't think they're going to ever have that capability in the near term to put a weapon on a drone. Will they be able to have the capability, perhaps purchase some kind of rudimentary drone, perhaps? But I don't see it. On WMD, this is something I've focused on for about 15 years, Al-Qaeda's ability to get it. Right now, they had a ricin program. They might have had an anthrax program. They've looked around for dirty nuclear bombs, radiological bombs, a little bit on the chemical side, but they've really kind of given up on that right now. They would like to go back to it, but quite frankly, it's too hard for them. The reason it's too hard for them because they're under enormous pressure. They're under enormous pressure in their headquarters, and they're under enormous pressure also in Europe and the United States. Prior to 9/11, and I was ambassador prior to 9/11, I was doing Al-Qaeda before 9/11, there was no pressure on this organization, overseas or in the U.S. They moved around. 19 people came into the United States to blow up our trade center with impunity. That has dramatically changed. They are still here in the United States, but they're under pressure. It's difficult for them to attain those type of weapons. And when I was at NYPD, we worked really hard to protect our radiological, chemical, and other sources that they might be able to tap to conduct that type of attack. So right now, I think they're years away from coming up with that kind of capability.
So who would be, their enablers in that regard? If you talk about weaponizing a crude drone, or not a drone, with VX or something of that nature, are we looking at Syria? Are we looking at friends in Pakistan, in the government, in the intelligence services? Who are we looking at?
Yes, sir, it's a good question. I think you're right that it would probably require a state to give them real capability for a WMD. It's just too hard to weaponize these things. I've spent a lot of time trying to figure how to weaponize them. And really it comes down to a state. Otherwise it's going to be a very small attack. Certainly Syria won't help Al-Qaeda. They're fighting them. The Pakistanis helping Al-Qaeda, that's our worst nightmare. We hope that never happens.
And is there evidence to support a theory that there are members of the Pakistani government, whether it's the intelligence services or otherwise, that are willing to be very helpful in that regard? How much of a concern do we have, should we have? And when I talked about Syria, I just meant the environment where the opportunity exists to receive the contraband, so to speak.
Right, sir. I believe that perhaps this is one of our most important intelligence requirements, is to keep our eye on the Pakistani intelligence and other people as to their relationship with some of these groups. Because certainly they've had long relationships, decades of relationship with some of these families, people, and groups. And would it be impossible for some of these either rogue or directed people to provide dangerous weapon systems to some of these organizations? It's possible, especially the organizations that they might arm to attack in Kashmir or in India. Those same type of weapon systems can then be turned against us. But I don't believe the Pakistani army, the Pakistani government, would countenance such an activity. It would come from below, perhaps, from a rogue. And I don't see any evidence of that happening right now. It's something we have to keep an eye on.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. At this point, seeing others, we'll roll into a quick round two, and then we'll let you all go because I think we have a few more questions still. Let me just ask to whoever can answer this question. I recently saw an article in the Daily Beast. It was entitled "CIA Falls Back in Afghanistan." Describe the CIA efforts to dismantle their operations in Afghanistan, and how is this going to be harmful to the effect to combat Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan? Just throw that out to whoever can answer that.
To a large degree, I know I am really not in a position to comment on that issue in an open hearing, Mr. Chairman. I would have to be in a closed hearing to make to give you my views on that issue. One thing that I will say that I did travel to Afghanistan in December, and a number of Afghans raised concerns to me about that issue. That's something I learned in an unclassified setting. But aside from that, I apologize, but I'm not able to answer that question in this setting.
Understood. Go ahead, sir.
The key commander who figures in those press reports is named Farouk al-Qahtani. And to your point, Congressman, about Al-Qaeda and the Taliban not having a lot of success against us historically in a direct fight against American forces, that's absolutely right. Unfortunately, Farouk al-Qahtani is one of the few guys who actually did have some success against American forces in a head-to-head fight. And he's the head of the organization in Kunar and Nuristan. Now, those are remote regions of Afghanistan, so that's a good thing. However, I think if you look at Al-Qaeda more holistically, you realize that we need that ongoing CIA help to fight them beyond Kunar and Nuristan.
And does core Al-Qaeda still matter? I mean, I still get confused with the idea of core Al-Qaeda, and you did a good job of explaining it, but to me, I think core Al-Qaeda kind of seems like a way of hedging this idea that we have Al-Qaeda on the run. We got core Al-Qaeda on the run, even though we have these huge offshoots. So does core Al-Qaeda still matter?
Well, I think the hedging point is right. I mean, that was the only way to argue that Al-Qaeda was being decimated or defeated, because if you look at their expansion elsewhere, it's kind of hard to argue that. But on a day-to-day basis at our website, you can see us document communications to and from Al-Qaeda senior leadership, including Zawahiri and others in quote-unquote core Al-Qaeda with their regional branches. That includes in Yemen or Syria or elsewhere. So yeah, they still do matter. They're providing, and it's not just ideological or strategic guidance. We find them providing on occasion tactical guidance in the day-to-day fight. In fact, I'll point back to that Treasury Department designation last week. A senior Al-Qaeda member in that designation relocated from Pakistan to Syria, and one of the reasons he did was to help the Al-Qaeda affiliated groups acquire heavy weapons from different sources throughout the Gulf.
I'm going to go ahead and yield back my time, and I'm going to recognize Mr. Sherman for 5 minutes.
Thank you. It's clear that Islamic extremism hasn't been defeated. We've won some important victories. I want to get away from the partisanship of, Al-Qaeda, all Islamic extremism hasn't been destroyed, therefore this president is bad, that president is good. Al-Qaeda happened during this administration, bin Laden was killed during that administration. It is one effort. And Truman and Eisenhower weren't bad presidents just because at the end of their terms the Soviet Union had not been defeated. We are engaged in a long war. We don't like long wars. We're going to have to win this long war. And I just got out of a hearing called Pivot to Asia. Well, what is that pivoting away from? I mean, I've watched some basketball games. You can't you can't pivot and then pivot. The fact is that a few rocks in the Pacific that remain uninhabited, even though they're off the coast of the most teeming continent, and have remained totally useless and uninhabited throughout history, which is why nobody knows who owns them, should not be our focus at a time when, as you gentlemen have testified, there are forces that would pull off another 9/11 if not confronted every single day. I'm trying to understand the Pakistani government. As far as I understand, those in Islamabad would not kill each other. That is to say, you don't have an ISI general who would kill another ISI general or a regular Pakistani army general or even one of the elected leaders. Okay, there's one former unelected leader who's in prison now, but aside from that. And yet, correct me if I'm wrong, there are elements of the Pakistani government waging effective war on the terrorists, and there are elements of the Pakistani government cooperating with the terrorists. I see some nodding heads, but perhaps I could get an oral response.
Well, I think that's right. I think there are two issues. One is the direct relationship between parts of the military intelligence establishment in Pakistan and Al-Qaeda. And I think those relationships do exist. Carlotta Gall from the New York Times reported about the ISI's bin Laden desk. I think the best way to fact check that and get into the what the actual relationship is and how that works is probably to have a more complete discussion about bin Laden's documents, the extensive files that were found in his compound and what they say. There's been reporting about what's in those files, but they haven't been released, and there's been no sort of systematic accounting for what's in them in this regard publicly, I mean, for your perspective. The second thing is...
So maybe Congress should get a classified briefing as to what's in those documents, at least our subcommittee, since that's the heart of what we do.
I think that, Congressman, that's a great idea. I think all congressmen should get a full briefing on the bin Laden documents, and I mean the full contents of the documents, and exactly asking how many files were captured, how many have been exploited and translated, and what they say in totality about
the idea that the administration or any administration will actually tell members of Congress anything is a wonderful fantasy.
It is a wonderful fantasy. But the other quick second point is that there's also the question about the Pakistani establishment, as the UN calls it, relationship with these other groups that are all allied with Al-Qaeda. In fact, we have this monograph that I contributed a chapter for my think tank, where I describe how all these groups that are sponsored by the ISI, that are creatures of the ISI establishment, are also allied with Al-Qaeda. And that's part of how Al-Qaeda gets the strategic depth. And I lay it all out in great detail how that works, from the Afghan Taliban to Lashkar-e-Taiba to Jaish-e-Mohammed.
And yet there are elements of the Pakistani establishment who would be killed by the very people being aided by the Pakistani establishment.
Well, that's
and I see Ambassador Sheehan nodding, but how, you know, those people that want to murder me, I usually don't donate to.
Right.
Can anybody give us a... Yeah, I do want to bring in one other factor, and that was our imposition of Karzai in Kabul, creating the risk in Pakistani military thinking to being attacked from both sides. A large Indian embassy in Kabul, which I'm sure is doing wonderful development work, but there are so many other poor countries around the world which could benefit from that. And of course it rings alarm bells in Islamabad. Why? So I can understand a bit why some in Islamabad say, well, we need the Taliban because we can't trust Kabul, and why we didn't install somebody who could who is more acceptable to Pakistan in Kabul. I don't know, but that was a long time ago. Ambassador Sheehan? So that was with the second or third assassination.
Third attempt.
Okay.
But I think in order to understand Pakistan, you have to understand their history and the trauma that they've gone through. Bangladesh broke off, and then Baluchistan almost broke off, and Pashtunistan, they're always trying to break off. And so Pakistan is paranoid about this breakup of its state, with good reason, by the way. It's not a state that truly exists. It's a state that's organized ad hoc after World War II.
So they're paranoid not only of India, but of also of separatism.
That's right. And so right now what they're trying to do is control Pashtun power within their federal tribal areas and in Afghanistan, and make sure they control that so that they will never have a breakup of their state. That's one of their reasons. It's much more complicated than that. But I think you have to understand it in terms of their paranoia about a breakup of the state. Also, they talk about strategic depth about India, which I never really quite understood. But I do understand their desire to control
Mr. Sidney?
A couple of points. I agree with what my co-panelists said, but it's even more complicated than that. In response to your point, Representative Sherman, even sometimes the fact that somebody wants to kill you is outweighed by the fact that they are even more valuable to you because of what they can do to people who are more likely to kill you. In other words, there's a calculation here. If I am really good at killing you, and Mr. Sheehan is less good at killing you, maybe you'll support him, even though he wants to kill you, if he'll attack me. So that's a kind of complicated equation that the Pakistanis
But in
find
that
themselves living in.
analysis, Karzai would have to be wanting to kill Pakistani leaders, and last I checked, that wasn't his objective.
Well, President Karzai and a number of other Afghans over the years have raised the issue of what's called Pashtunistan, which essentially is an extension of Afghanistan to the banks of the Indus, which goes right to the heart of that state identity that Ambassador Sheehan was saying. But one final point about Pakistan that's important. Pakistan is not a country. It's not a government. There are a number of systems there. The most important and overwhelming one is the military intelligence one. This is a country where last month Hamid Mir, the Larry King, if you will, of Pakistan, the #1 journalist interviewer who had interviewed almost all the top leaders of Pakistan on his show, was the subject of an assassination attempt. He had, before the assassination attempt, had communicated to his family that if such an assassination attempt took place, it was ISI that was trying to kill him. So just imagine in the United States if
there are many in our establishment that would want to kill various journalists, but so far that hasn't occurred.
That's the kind of complicated geography of politics and terrorism that the Pakistanis live under, and this is a country that has some serious structural problems, as Ambassador Sheehan has mentioned, that until they are solved, which won't be for years, the Al-Qaeda threat's going to remain.
And how many nuclear weapons do they have? Don't bother us. Thank you.
All right, gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Cotton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you all for your time today. I read with interest over the weekend some news reports about FBI Director James Comey, who was reflecting on his early tenure at the Bureau, saying that when he had entered, he expected to put the FBI back on its traditional footing of law enforcement based on the public statements of the administration and Al-Qaeda being on the run. He now says, and this is a quote from those stories, "I didn't have anywhere near the appreciation I got after I came into this job just how virulent those affiliates had become. They are both many more than I appreciated, and they are stronger than I appreciated." Starting with you, Mr. Jocelyn, and then moving from right to left, my right, your left. Do you care to comment on what Mr. Comey as a private citizen might have been missing, and now what he might be seeing as a senior official in the administration?
Well, I think the simple fact of the matter is that they're putting the organizational relationships aside for a moment, and that's my specialty, but putting that aside, there are now more groups fighting in Al-Qaeda's name or in Al-Qaeda's ideology or espousing Al-Qaeda sort of style jihad than ever, and that goes from Africa throughout the Middle East into South Asia. And so, if you actually delve into each story is different in each location, but you now have a threat that is much different than the one that existed on 9/11. In some places, it's a lesser threat. In some places, it's a growing threat and becoming even more problematic.
Mr. Ambassador?
I think there's two parts of it, sir. One, he was getting intelligence briefs internationally. As Tom had said, Al-Qaeda is spreading and taking advantage of unlawful places all around the world and growing in strength in a very troubling way. But he also was probably briefed domestically. When I was at NYPD, I was part of the Joint Terrorism Task Force in New York City, and he probably found all these briefings about within the United States, the types of folks that he needs to worry about. That right now, the ones that I worried about when I was in New York City were the ones that would travel to Pakistan and come back, like Faisal Shahzad, the Times Square bomber, or those that were willing to get support from the outside and conduct an operation. And some, like the Boston bombers, who did it pretty much on their own. So I'm sure he was getting those briefings and probably was surprised to find how many people within the United States, given the chance, would be willing to take violence against American citizens.
And Mr. Sidney?
I think that the new FBI director went in thinking the way most Americans do, that this is really something that is pretty much past, the threat from Al-Qaeda. And going back to the point that Ambassador Sheehan made, our military, our intelligence, our law enforcement agencies over the last 12 plus years have made an incredible effort. They have been hugely successful. A lot of that success is not known. People are safe today, people are alive today because of the many plots that have been stopped. And unless you know all the things that are coming after us, unless you know that they've been stopped, and most of that can never be told, then you don't appreciate the threat. And I think that is, in many ways, a core message from all of us here, that those threats are still happening, and the threat of more to come is still happening. And yes, this has been a long war. It's going to continue to be a long war, but if we don't keep fighting it, it won't be something we'll read about in history books, because then there'll be a question of whether there's history books to read.
Thank you. A second news report I read with interest recently said that Iran is recruiting Afghan refugees, paying them several $100s a month to fight in Syria on behalf of Bashar al-Assad. I would presume transiting them through Iran, through Herat and Farah provinces. The reports alluded to them being Shiites. I was wondering if you would care to comment on the report and whether in fact this is happening, where they're coming from in Afghanistan, if they are. But secondarily, do we see much evidence of links between Al-Qaeda in the Afghan-Pakistan border region doing the same on the Sunni side in Syria? Again, start with Mr. Jocelyn.
Well, I'll take the latter part. Actually, there's this relationship that I've documented over and over again. It's very curious between Al-Qaeda and the Iranian regime. And this administration in July of 2011, December of 2011, February of 2012, October of 2012, in 2013, and again earlier this year, has repeatedly, through the State Department and the Treasury Department, documented the relationship between the Iranian regime and Al-Qaeda. The fact that there's this facilitation network on Iranian soil that Al-Qaeda uses to move fighters around to Syria and elsewhere. So this is something that the core general command leadership in AFPAC is sort of very interested in doing, and is doing through Iranian soil, so it doesn't surprise me.
I agree with Tom, and it's interesting, we talked about Pakistan's dysfunction. The Iranians do the same thing. Here they are supporting Al-Qaeda members coming through their country to join forces that are then fighting against their own surrogates in Syria and against Assad, who they're supporting. So they, too, all operate on both sides of the fence, and it's somewhat interesting. I've been out of government. I read the same report, sir, and I believe it to be plausible. They're probably Shias. They're being paid mercenaries. The Iranians are paying people to fight that war, primarily Hezbollah and others, to help the Assad regime fight the opposition.
And Mr. Sedney?
I agree. Again, this is another complex issue. The Al-Qaeda is clearly anti-Shia. Al-Qaeda is clearly anti-Iran, but Al-Qaeda has had leadership figures in Iran under the semi-protection of the Iranian government since certainly 2002. So Iran has been protecting those whose ideology is to destroy the state. The role of the United States there is important because, going back to the point that I made to Mr. Sherman, Iran also sees the United States as an enemy, and certainly elements of the Iranian security forces are ready to use any tool, even those that might threaten themselves, in order to be able to do things that undermine the United States. But this is a complicated thing. It's not just a good guy versus bad guy. There's many varieties of bad guys out there.
Thank you. I see my time, though hopefully not the witness's patience, has expired.
All right, gentlemen, yields back. Seeing no other questions, Chair wishes to thank our witnesses, and the subcommittee stands adjourned.